scrappy flyweights coming up on this weekend's card, headlined by Lewis and Spivak. We have the former Fight Night's global champ, Zhalgas Zhumagulov, taking on InnerG, Charles Johnson, the former LFA flyweight champ. He won the interim belt. He defended the interim belt, and then he was able to win that unified belt, but was it really unified? He beat Carlos Moda, a guy who's also in the UFC at this point. Johnson had a really hard time out in his UFC debut, took on Muhammad Mokaev, who may very well fight for the title someday, and in that fight, Mokaev landed 12 of 26 takedown attempts, and he was able to really win out in that one aspect. Didn't do any damage, at all in that fight. But it was really the wrestling and the constant pressure that was able to get it done. And for Charles Johnson, it's been said by a lot of other people, if I'm not mistaken, we said it too. If every fight was a 5-round fight, Charles Johnson would win 9.5 out of 10 fights. Because Johnson has incredible cardio. He has such a wild base for MMA. Boxing experience. He was an AAU national champion in track and field and a 2-time national champion in steeplechase. He's played multiple different sports. He has a Kay Hansen background in boxing. He was 1-5-4 between 2017 and 2020. Okay. And listen, it's good to have that experience, I guess. He's a Golden Gloves guy. But for Charles Johnson, it really is. Nice kicks from the outside, holds his hands relatively low. He will get out-wrestled in certain exchanges, but that opens up his scrambles, and his offensive wrestling is so very good. And that's why in this matchup with Zhumagulov, a guy coming off a split decision loss to Jeff Maryna, a fight where, if you look on MMA decisions, 12-1, the people that scored it for Zhumagulov. But I know I threw a tweet out there and I went back and found it. I had it 29-28 Maryna in the fight, but I also put after that, if it was a 30-27 Zhumagulov, I wouldn't cry robbery. It was a really, really close fight. Zhumagulov was on him like the butter that I had on my blueberry bagel this morning. He was all over him, trying to get the takedown, trying to push forward. But you look at it for Zhumagulov, 1-4 in the UFC, and he's still around. He must be doing something right. And every fight that he's had, I can talk about a point where Zhumagulov had success in that one.
I just think Zhumagulov's a perfect example of a great test for any prospect making their way up the division. And he's a good fighter too, because whether you do win or whether you lose to him, it's not going to be so devastating that, you can't get your career back on track if you do lose to him. And if you beat him, he's still probably going to expose one weakness that you had in your game.
He sent Jerome Rivera out of the UFC. Jerome Rivera dusted him.
Jerome Rivera didn't have a great experience in the UFC, so I wouldn't say that's the best example. But for Zhumagulov, if you are that top-level prospect, you're probably going to look good against him. And that's why I do like Zhumagulov, because he is a well-rounded enough fighter to where, again, whatever your strength is, he can probably match you in some of those areas. And then whatever your weakness is, he's going to try to take advantage of that. But the problem that I've always had with Zhalgas is he's almost too aggressive for his own good, be it with the wrestling or with the striking. He's a guy who leaves himself wide open. He's a guy who, when he goes for wrestling attacks, when he goes for his own takedowns, he'll leave his neck out there. You can threaten with a submission, try to go for a transition off that and really threaten and be dominant with some of those positions, but that also shows up in his striking too. He's someone who can lunge when he is aggressive, but what I like about this fight is I hope it does go late, because I agree with you. Charles Johnson is a guy who does get stronger as the fight goes on, can fight at the same pace for the whole entire fight. What Zhumagulov does well to a lot of these prospects is he will maintain a fairly straightforward pace for the majority of the fight and threaten you with volume striking, power striking, and wrestling. So I think as this fight goes late, we're going to learn a lot more about Charles Johnson, because you're right. In the Mokaev fight, A, Mokaev might be a future title challenger. He really does have that kind of a ceiling. And B, he laid on top of Charles Johnson for the majority of that fight. There wasn't a lot that you could really take from it from Charles Johnson's camp. So I think this is a great reset for him against a guy who, you're right, he's probably one of the most well-known 1-4 fighters in the UFC, because for Zhumagulov, again, do you think he's ever going to go in there and beat guys in the top 10? Maybe not. But I don't think he's an easy fight for any of those guys, honestly.
And flyweight's absolutely stacked with talent. At this point, there's more people outside of the rankings than there are ranked fighters. And a few years ago, there was 3 guys outside of the rankings and then the top 15. But for Zhumagulov, you go and you look through it. Let's focus on the last 3 fights. He was a -315 favorite against Jerome Rivera. Well, he won that fight quite easily. He then goes in there. He's a +240 underdog against Kopp. He gets knocked out. He was a +155 underdog against Jeff Maryna. And then before that, his fight against Raulian Paiva, most people thought that he won that fight. And then his next fight, he took on Amir Albazi, won the first round. Round 2, round 3, it was the waves of Albazi.
Talented fighters, too.
And for Johnson, as a champ over with LFA, wins a split decision over Yuma Horiguchi, who I thought won the fight. And Yuma lost a point early in that one for a nut shot. He beats Joao Camilo. He ends up finishing him in that one. And in the fight against Carlos Mota looked pretty good early on with a lot of those long-range striking attacks, sending Johnson back. But as the fight went on, round 3, round 4, and then when Johnson ended up getting the finish, he really did look good as that one went on. So we look at the odds in this one. Johnson open to -175, -165 right now. Zhumagulov open +150, +135. We have a look at the Topology votes. Surprised as they are to you, Zhumagulov's 1-4 in the UFC, and that's bad.
It is.
But he's better than a 1-4 fighter in the UFC, if that makes any sense. I'm going to say Johnson over-under 65%.
I think it'll be under.
Think it's going to be under?
I've been bad at these, though.
Way over. 570 total votes, 82% Johnson, 68% by decision, 23% by knockout. If he knocks out Zhalgas Zhumagulov, it would surprise me. 18% that of Zhumagulov, 78% by decision. I could see this one going to a decision. It's the trouble of Johnson has the boxing experience, but you watch him fight and he's not a boxer at all. He holds his hands really low. He doesn't really throw in combination a lot. His kicks open everything up. He kicks to the head, body, and to the legs. Spent some time at Tiger Muay Thai. He was, if I'm not mistaken, a Tiger Muay Thai scholarship recipient, somewhat similar to Mallory Martin, if you want to go that way. But for Johnson, it's a lot of kicks and not a lot of boxing. For Zhumagulov, it's a lot of plant and throw. And he talked about it. His over-aggressiveness can cost him in a lot of matchups. I don't know if this is going to be the one, just because for Zhumagulov, he's at such a height disadvantage and reach disadvantage against a lot of his opponents. In this one, it is pronounced. And the other thing for Johnson is, think of the tallest flyweights you know. Nate Maness was 5'10" a couple weeks ago. Lost his fight. Who else? Like, there's not a lot of really tall guys in this division. Johnson's one of them. We'll see if that amounts to anything in the fight. I think you're going to get a lot of wrestling, a lot of scrambles. I'm going to go with the younger guy in Charles Johnson in this one. I think he's got a little bit more once it gets down to the mat than Zhalgas does. But we saw Zhalgas look great against Jeff Molina his last time out and surprised a lot of people.
Exactly. Whether you thought he won or lost that fight, you were definitely impressed by the performance that he was able to put in. And Jeff Molina is one of the most hyped up prospects in the division. I know Makayev, we just talked about, he's another one of those guys, but Jeff Molina is cut from that same cloth for the most part, and he's a guy who a lot of people think will be in that top 5 sooner rather than later. So I think for Zhumagulov, it is unfortunate the position they just find himself to be in, because if you lose to Charles Johnson, you doubt they're going to keep him around, which is unfortunate to say, because it's been a memorable run. But I agree with you. I also have Charles Johnson in the fight.
Both of us going with Marcelago's own Charles Johnson to get the win. Let us know if you have Erkan Kusha and American Top Teams, Zhalgas Zhumagulov. Some great fights on this card. I don't know. I'm looking forward to Danny Roberts, Jack Della Maddalena. You should tune into that fight. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, we always say. Let's get into it.